The first photograph she ever sent had been torn in half. He never wrote back. That was in the spring of 1871, when the wind still bore frost along the high plains, and she stood on the edge of a boarding platform in St. Louis, hands trembling around a linen envelope. It contained a letter, 5 cents in stamps, and the one good likeness she had, her in a cornflower dress, hair plaited neatly, dark eyes serious beneath the brim of a borrowed bonnet. The man was a cattle rancher in Kansas who wanted a God-fearing wife. He'd requested modest temperament, sturdy background, and no previous entanglements. He hadn't said white. But the letter never came back. No reply, no forwarding, only silence. That was how many of them went. Some were polite enough to answer, declining with phrases like differences in character or not what I envisioned. Others returned the photo with crude notes scribbled on the back. Don't need no black stock breeding here or you'd rot out in the sun, woman. Her name was Mariah Thompson, born to a seamstress in Georgia, freed by ink and paper when she was 7, and carried north by a preacher who took in widows and strays. He taught her to read by candlelight, taught her to pray with a spine straight as a gunstock, taught her the land wouldn't love her, but she could make it fear her. At 24, she was too dark for comfort, too soft-spoken for cities, and too alone to remain. So she'd answered advertisements from widowers and ranchers and lonesome miners in mining towns where the sun never set easy. She traveled with a false name sometimes, Mary T., and sometimes not. She slept in shared boxcars and hitched rides in merchant wagons. In each new town, she carried a letter of inquiry and a fading hope that somewhere a man would see her worth beyond the skin her mother gave her. By the time she reached Grafton, Wyoming, she had nothing left but a cedar trunk and a piece of paper stained from being read too many times. It was from a man named Richard Olson, 52, widower, no children, ranch outside of town. He needed help, he said, someone who wouldn't mind the wind or the solitude. She arrived in late October. The first person to greet her was not Olson, but a boy from the freight company who wrinkled his nose at her and spat when she asked for directions. Up that road, he said, pointing. Doubt he'll want you. He didn't. Olson saw her at the gate and blinked twice like he was squinting through smoke. Then he shook his head. You didn't say, he muttered. Hell, girl, you didn't say you was colored. I didn't say I wasn't, she answered. That earned her a glare. He let her sleep one night in the shed behind the main house. She left the next morning without breakfast, without pay. And so it went. By December, she was living in the rear room of a dry goods store, helping the owner's wife with inventory. Word had spread fast through the town's 8 dusty streets about the colored woman who came looking for a husband like she was white. They called her names when they thought she couldn't hear. Some of the boys from the saloon tossed rocks at the windows. Then came the first snow, and with it, a new figure on the street. He arrived without noise, stepping off a coach with a limp and a thick coat slung over one shoulder. No one greeted him. No one offered to carry his bag. He was not a hero here. He wasn't anything anymore. His name was Elias Cutter. A veteran of Shiloh and Chickamauga, lost his left hand in the wilderness and walked with a pinched hip from Gettysburg. He looked like a man carved out of lead, gray eyes, heavy jaw, face lined with the kind of silence war sears into a man's bones. He had a room upstairs at the inn and no fixed purpose. People said he'd come west because the South was too full of ghosts. Said he owned nothing but a deck of cards, a flask, and a tarnished Union saber he'd pawned to pay for whiskey. He noticed her the first day, noticed her again the next. She caught him watching her stack cans through the shop window, his mouth set in a line too careful to read. He didn't speak until the 3rd week. That morning, a sheet of snow had fallen, and the store was slow. She was sweeping the step when she heard the click of a cane on the boardwalk. She looked up. You sweep like a soldier marches, he said. She narrowed her eyes. And what do you know of soldiers? He tapped his hip. Enough. She almost smiled, almost, but her fingers stayed clenched around the broom. He tilted his head. You're the one they call Mary T. Mariah, she corrected. He nodded, not apologizing. You danced before. The question stunned her. He was staring at her feet, not like the others stared, assessing, measuring, but like he was picturing something that wasn't there. My ma was a fiddler, he said. Used to play reels, told me even in the dark some feet remember the tune. I haven't danced since I was a girl. He raised a brow, then I'd say you're overdue. That was the first time she felt her heart stutter in her chest, not from fear or rage, but from something old and starved. She didn't answer, didn't say yes. But she didn't say no. Later that week, he came back with a phonograph. It was dented, but it worked. He set it down outside the shop in the half-melted snow and asked her again. Just once, he said, a man ought to see something good before he dies. And for the first time in years, she stepped into the center of the street. Not a soul moved, not the drunk at the saloon's porch, not the banker's clerk who always looked at her sideways. Even the butcher's boy paused with blood on his apron. Elias wound the crank, and the record clicked once, then twice, then spilled a violin into the cold air. She didn't dance like a girl trying to be pretty. She danced like someone who knew what it was to be looked at like a stain and a shame and a thing best left outside. She danced like someone who had waited too long to be asked. He watched her, hand resting against the cane, lips parted just enough to let the wind slip through. When the song ended, he didn't clap, he didn't smile. He bowed his head. And in that moment, with every shutter on Main Street creaking closed and every throat holding breath, Mariah Thompson became a woman they could not ignore. They'd tried silence, they'd tried mockery. But now she stood at the center of their street, head high, feet steady, sweat on her brow, and not a single person could pretend she was invisible. She had been rejected, scorned, sent packing again and again. But that day, Elias Cutter asked her to dance. And something in the town shifted. They wouldn't understand it yet, not fully. But something had begun. After the dance, nobody spoke to her for a week. The dry goods shop kept her behind the shelves, counting nails and folding linens. Mrs. Langley, the owner's wife, stopped saying good morning. The minister's wife crossed the street when she saw her coming. Boys watched her with the kind of grin that had weight behind it, waiting for her to fall, maybe, or for something uglier. But Elias kept coming. Not with flowers or promises or any soft thing, just with his cane and his crooked gait and his quiet, weathered presence. He asked questions sometimes, what her father did, what she believed happened after death, what made her stay. She never answered the last one. Instead, she asked her own. What made a man come west with half a leg and no hand, wearing a coat he never took off even when the sun returned? He told her once that he shot a boy by mistake in Franklin, Tennessee. 16, no boots, running the wrong way with a saber too big for his grip. I still see him, he said. I still see my mother, she replied. That was the only day they talked about ghosts. By spring, the town had settled into the discomfort of her presence. She had not left like they expected. She had not broken, not shrunk. She walked to work every day in a plain brown skirt and lived in the attic of the Langley store, where frost bloomed on the windows and mice rattled through the grain. Elias began walking her home, not out of duty. He never offered his arm, never said more than a few words, but she could hear his cane behind her, steady as a drumbeat. The townsfolk started calling her Cutter's girl. They didn't say it kindly. One afternoon, someone tied a dead pigeon to the doorknob of her room. She untied it without a word and buried it in the alley behind the feed store. That night, Elias came to her attic room, jaw like iron. Was it Olson? He asked. She shook her head. Don't matter who it was. He looked like he might burn something down. Instead, he took off his coat. First time she'd seen his shoulder, the ruined arm, the empty sleeve tucked and pinned. His skin was riddled with scar, pale over muscle, the shape of old burns curling like vines across his back. You think I scare easy, she said. He didn't answer, just sat on the floor beside her narrow bed and stared at the wall. After that, they met at night, not for sin, not even for touch. They sat on the hill above the town where the grass bent low and the stars hummed like distant bells. She told him about Georgia, how the fields smelled in August, the way her mother sang when she sewed, the time a man came to their door and claimed her mother owed him still. She'd been 9 then, and she'd watched her mother pull a knife from the hem of her dress. She got him in the thigh, she said. Didn't kill him, but he limped after that. Elias let out a sound, half laugh, half breath. Good woman, he said. Better than me, she murmured. No. She didn't correct him. The rains came, the river swelled. The roads turned to clay, and every wagon wheel in town stuck fast. The roof of the church collapsed under wet rot. A child drowned in the pasture trying to catch frogs. Mariah helped wrap the body. No one thanked her. She wore black gloves and kept to herself, but they still whispered. That's when the marshal came to her door. His name was Bryce Maddox, big man with white hair and hands like butcher's blocks. He'd been sheriff 10 years, and he didn't like things that changed. You'll want to be careful, girl, he said. She met his eyes. I'm always careful. He leaned on her doorframe. Folks here are slow to trust, but quick to hate. You keep walking with that crippled bastard, and someone's bound to make a mess of it. She stared at him. You threatening me, Marshal? He tilted his head. I'm reminding you what kind of place this is. After he left, she sat on the edge of her bed and waited for the fear to come. But it didn't, not the same way it used to. Instead, she wrote a letter. It was to herself. She wrote the words, "You are not small, you are not meant to vanish. You are a woman made of blood and sorrow and fire, and no man will unmake you." She folded it, put it in the lining of her coat. The next day, she kissed Elias. He didn't flinch. He held her like a man who knew every kind of break and had learned to bear them all. After that, the trouble began in earnest. A fire in the shed behind the store, a stone through the window. Someone slashed Elias' horse's flank. He didn't ride again after that. The town turned meaner. They didn't use her name anymore, just slurs. Elias tried to keep her out of sight, but she wouldn't be hidden. She went to church one Sunday in a gray dress with a lilac pin, sat in the back pew. Nobody would sit near her. The minister didn't look at her once. But she stayed the whole service. That night, Elias came to her and said, "You don't have to prove anything." She looked at him. "I ain't proving, I'm surviving." He nodded, and she saw something soften in him, not pity, respect. The next week, he asked her to come with him to a dance. It was held in the barn behind the McClellan farm, a yearly thing for planting season. She said no, then yes, then no again. But the day came, and she braided her hair and wore the cornflower dress again. The same one from the photograph, mended a dozen times but still whole. They rode out together, slow along the rutted road. The barn glowed with lanterns, fiddles sang, laughter spilled out into the fields. But when they stepped inside, the music stopped. Elias' cane tapped once against the floor. Mariah stepped forward. No one offered a hand, no one moved. She turned to go. And then from the corner, a young girl, barefoot, freckled, stood and came to her. "My brother's an ass," the girl said, "but I'm not." She reached out, took Mariah's hand. The fiddler struck up a reel. And in that barn, with every eye on her, Mariah danced again. This time, she smiled. This time, she didn't care if they watched. Because she wasn't dancing for them. She was dancing for herself. And for Elias, who watched her with the look of a man who had found a reason to keep breathing. The war had taken his hand. But she had given him back something far rarer. A future. The storm wasn't over. But they had survived the first lash of it. And they would survive the rest. Together. They didn't burn the house until summer. It was a dry season, brittle with wind and dust. Grass turned to straw beneath every step, and even the river wore down to a dull trickle, exposing bones of fish and rusted wagon parts. People grew meaner when the land starved. Mariah had moved in with Elias by then, not in sin, not in secret. He asked her plain, and she said yes plain. There was no preacher to bless it, but there was firewood to chop and bread to bake, and a man to help up from the porch when his legs stiffened in the morning cold. She kept the home, and he kept the door bolted. Their cabin sat on the edge of a red bluff where the trees were thin and crooked. It had once belonged to a trapper who died in his sleep. Elias had bought it with money saved from pawned medals and a month's labor hauling freight. They planted turnips and beans. She made a quilt from flour sacks. He carved her a spoon with his one hand. When she burned stew, he ate it anyway. When he woke from dreams clenched in sweat, she laid her hand on his chest and did not speak. They lived quiet until someone decided it had been quiet long enough. It began with hoof prints around the well. Then the salt vanished from the cellar. Then the chickens were gutted and left in a pile beside the fence, feathers splayed like a warning. Mariah said nothing. Elias said less, but he began sleeping with a pistol beside the bed. The fire came at night. It started at the corner of the cabin, near the eaves where kindling was stacked. By the time Mariah smelled it, the smoke had already crept in beneath the floorboards. She woke Elias with a shove. They didn't scream, didn't panic. They moved like people who had escaped worse. The cabin burned fast. The roof folded in like paper. They stood in the yard, wrapped in blankets, and watched everything they'd built crackle into ash. In the morning, the sheriff came, not Maddox. He'd been thrown from his horse a month prior and hadn't walked straight since. This was a new one, younger, nervous. He didn't ask who did it. He asked if Elias wanted to press charges. Elias looked at the scorched earth and said, "Would it matter?" The boy didn't answer. They lived in the barn after that, what was left of it. She tacked up canvas over the broken door and laid old feed sacks across the floor. He mended the rafters with salvaged boards. They didn't leave, and that made the town restless. Because they were supposed to go, supposed to tuck tail and run like all the others had before. But Mariah planted again, this time with corn, and Elias cut a new trail to the creek with a hatchet and sheer will. The day she turned 26, they didn't speak of birthdays or candles, but Elias gave her a box. Inside it was a pocket knife. The handle was smooth bone, carved with her initials. "I don't need protection," she said. He nodded. "It's not for them, it's for you." She kept it under her pillow. Late in August, word came that a traveling reverend would be holding baptisms and weddings in the next county. Mariah said nothing when she heard, but Elias noticed the way her hands trembled that night when she washed the pan. So he made a plan. It was simple, a wagon ride, 2 witnesses, a man in black with a Bible and a good memory. They married beneath a willow tree near the Green Hollow Chapel. No family, no friends, just dust and sun and the sound of her name spoken soft and solemn, Mariah Thompson Cutter. They didn't kiss before the crowd, but when they reached the wagon again, Elias leaned in and pressed his forehead to hers. "You still sure?" he asked. She smiled. "I've never been surer of anything in my life." But marriage didn't quiet the town, it sharpened it. Now they weren't just an oddity, they were a challenge, a mark against God's order, some said, an insult to the memory of every dead boy in gray. One man spat on the ground when she passed and muttered, "Should have left your kind in chains." She turned slow, looked him in the eye, "And your kind should have learned to lose better." Elias had to drag her away. She let him. They began receiving letters, folded notes left on fence posts in chicken coops nailed to the barn. "Filth breeds filth. One bullet and it all ends." He fought for the wrong side after all. Elias wanted to leave, not out of fear but weariness. But Mariah stood her ground. "This land hates me," she said, "but it will learn to fear me too." So they stayed. And then came the night of the riders. She saw them from the window, 4 shapes on horseback, faces covered in burlap, rifles slung low. Elias was already moving, pistol in hand, jaw clenched like a trap. But they didn't come to shoot, they came to warn. One rider called out, "Next time, the barn won't be all that burns." Mariah stood on the porch, rifle in her arms, dressed in white. "Then you'd best come ready to die," she said. The men paused just long enough, then turned and rode away. After that, the quiet came again. But it was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. And Mariah Cutter knew storms. She didn't wait for it. She started gathering names, started asking questions. There were whispers in town about who had the matches, who tied the pigeon, who rode in the dark. One name came up more than once. Henry Talbot, a ranch hand with a mean streak and a bad-shaped chip on his shoulder. He'd been turned down for deputy, turned bitter since. He was also the brother of the freckled girl who had danced with Mariah at the McClellan barn. Mariah waited, watched, listened. She didn't believe in mercy. Not anymore. And when she made her move, it would not be for justice. It would be for something older. Something blood knew. And bone remembered. She was not done. Not yet. Henry Talbot didn't see her watching. Not when he stumbled out of the saloon with whiskey sweat on his collar. Not when he cursed his horse for spooking in the dark. Not when he took the long way home through the cottonwood stand behind the blacksmith's yard. But she saw him. She'd watched him for 3 nights from the old silo near the tracks, cloaked in shadow, rifle resting across her knees. She was patient, always had been. The girl who had learned to walk barefoot through brambles, to still her breath beneath floorboards when patrols came looking, to sew a wound shut with no light but the moon. The 4th night, she followed him. Not to kill him, not yet. To learn how the thing inside him moved. Because a man who hates in secret is dangerous, but a man who hates openly and feels protected in that hate is something worse. He's untouchable until he bleeds. She trailed him to the shed behind the tannery, saw him meet 2 others, one with a busted lip, the other wore a deputy's pin he hadn't earned. They passed around a bottle, then a scrap of paper. Mariah didn't need to read it to know what it meant. She waited until they left, slipped inside the shed. Found the plan. They were going to set a fire at the mill, blame the colored man who hauled sacks there on Thursdays, use the distraction to drag Elias from his barn and finish what they'd started. Cowards always needed fire and a crowd. She took the paper, slipped it into her coat. That night she told Elias. He said nothing for a long time, just sat by the lantern, face hollow with rage and memory. Then he said, "If I kill him, they'll hang me." She nodded. "If you kill him," she said, "they might not find the body." He looked up, met her eyes. "No," he said, "that Stain's mine to carry." But she wasn't thinking of Stain. She was thinking of fire. Of the woman who had buried her life in the ashes of a cabin and stood up anyway. The plan came fast. Elias wrote a false note, shaky handwriting, misspelled town names. It claimed to be from a Confederate cousin looking for Henry, claimed to have Newsworth coin. Mariah delivered it herself, disguised as a boy, hat pulled low, voice roughened. "Found this in my pa's barn," she said, tossing it at Henry's feet. He barely looked at her, grunted, pocketed it. She turned and walked, counted each step. The meeting was to be held at an old trapping lodge 4 miles from town, long abandoned, no windows, 1 door. Elias rode out first, left at dusk, no questions. Mariah waited. She had the other half of the plan. As the sun dropped, she rode to the McClellan farm, found the freckled girl. "You ever wonder why your brother's never home on nights there's blood?" The girl stared at her, then nodded just once. Mariah handed her the paper, the one from the shed. "Give it to the marshal," she said, "before dawn." The girl hesitated. "You trust me?" "No," Mariah said, "but I trust your hate for what he's become." And that was enough. She rode next to the creek and waited. The moon rose pale and bruised. Then the shot came. Distant one echo, then silence. She mounted and rode, fast. When she reached the lodge, she found Elias leaning against the doorframe, pistol lowered, blood on his shirt. Inside, Henry lay gasping. Not dead, not yet. Elias didn't look at her when he spoke. "I told him I remembered his face," he said. "At the camp outside Nashville, he was 15. I spared him then." Mariah stepped over the threshold. Henry's eyes rolled toward her. "You'll hang," he rasped. "No," she said, "you will." She turned to Elias. "Leave him. Let the law take it." He nodded, but she saw the shake in his hand, the old tremble that came when ghosts stirred too deep. So she took the pistol, led him out. They rode back under stars that flickered like breath. In town, the marshal was waiting, letter in hand. He didn't speak, just stepped aside. Let them pass. The next day, Henry was found in the lodge, alive. He confessed everything. They tried to hang him that night, but the marshal stopped it. For the first time, law had done what rage could not. Mariah didn't smile. Justice was never sweet. It was bitter and hard and too late. But it was done. The townsfolk no longer looked her in the eye, not from hate, from shame. And that, she thought, was enough. Not forgiveness, not welcome. Just the silence that comes when people know they failed and have to live beside the proof. She and Elias rebuilt, not the cabin, themselves. He taught her to shoot with her eyes closed. She taught him to laugh when his hip gave out. They planted again. And the land, slowly, began to give. Corn came tall, beans fat. And sometimes at dusk, she would hear music from a far-off porch, fiddle strings cutting through wind. She never danced in the street again. She didn't need to. The first time had been for them. The last time had been for her. What came after was survival. And that, at last, was hers. The barn stood through the fall storms. Wind peeled at the shingles and cold came early, but the walls held. Elias patched the leaks in silence while Mariah boiled potatoes and lye soap. By winter, their breath hung in the air inside, but neither of them minded. They had lived through worse. News of what happened spread slowly beyond Grafton. A newspaper out of Laramie printed a paragraph about a mixed union holding firm against terror. The word mixed was meant to sting. Mariah circled it with charcoal and pinned it above the door. Elias never asked why. He understood. The preacher from St. Aloysius came by once, said he'd bless the land if they wished, said it might help with the yield come spring. Mariah told him the land didn't care for blessing. It only respected what was earned in blood and sweat and silence. He didn't come back. That winter passed like breath through chapped lips. Long, slow, painful, the kind that teaches you which bones will break first and which will mend wrong. Elias grew slower. The cold stiffened his joints until he cursed just tying his boots. Mariah chopped the wood then, her hands blistering, her back bending lower each day. She didn't complain, not once. But one night, she found him staring too long at the fire. "When I was young," he said, "I thought the worst thing that could happen was dying alone." She sat beside him, quiet. "I was wrong," he said. "The worst thing is knowing you'll leave someone behind in a world like this." She didn't cry, but her fingers gripped his like rope. "I'll bury you deep," she whispered, "and I'll make sure no man forgets your name." He smiled, not out of peace, out of pain. By spring, he was gone. She buried him under the twisted pine at the bluff's edge, the one where he'd once carved her initials with his teeth clamped from the ache in his arm. She buried him with his pistol and the spoon he made her, nothing more. When the townsfolk came with flowers and apologies, she took neither. Instead, she handed each of them a stone and made them help raise the marker. No cross, no verse, just a slab that read, Elias Cutter. A man who did not turn away. After they left, she sat beside it and read aloud every letter she'd written over the years. Letters never sent, ones addressed to men who never replied, some addressed to herself. Each one she burned in a small iron bowl, watched the smoke rise, watched it drift east. She stayed on that land. Others thought she might leave. Sell the plot, head to Denver or farther, disappear into the hills like a ghost with nothing left to anchor her. But she stayed. Because the land had seen her suffer. Because the dirt held the echo of her dance, the blood of her fight, and the fire that tried to erase her. Because somewhere in the roots, Elias still listened. and because staying was its own kind of vengeance. Years passed slowly at first. Children came to her door asking about the war, about the fire, about the night she stood in the street and defied a town. She didn't tell them everything, just enough. She taught a few to raid, taught one to shoot. They called her Mrs. Cutter. No one dared call her Mary T again. By the time she turned 40, the bones in her hands had begun to ache. She stopped sewing, took up whittling, left small wooden birds at fences and doorsteps, a silent kind of blessing. And one morning, after a long night of wind and thunder, she stepped onto the porch with her rifle, scanned the horizon, and found nothing waiting to harm her. The silence that filled her then was not fear. It was the peace of a woman who had been tested and not found wanting. She walked to the bluff, sat beside the grave, and she said, "They still look, they still don't speak, but they know that's enough." The wind carried her voice, soft through the trees. She closed her eyes. And somewhere in the tall grass, a fiddle began to play, not from town, not from memory, but from deep inside her. The tune of something earned. Not love, not justice, survival. And she was the last one left to sing it. That was how Mariah Cutter remained. Not as a wife, not as a bride, but as a mark on the land that could not be washed away.